We're always told that Boris Johnson writes his own speeches, and even the normal bit at the beginning was quite sort of Johnson and boosterish.
There's clearly he has a base speech, and he basically takes them and scribbles all over them, and he obviously shuffled them while he did that. Actually, that bit of it that can basically happen. The bit where he lost his place, I don't know about you, David. You possibly haven't done that because you're incredibly fluent. I have done that a couple of times, and actually, usually it's the speeches I know best. You lose your place in them, but. It was that other stuff, the stuff he'd scribbled down, really, which just wasn't appropriate to the circumstances. And the Peppa Pig thing, for example, was that.
But that came post losing. I wondered whether that was properly. That wasn't even written. He was just literally just freewheeling at that point.
Well, that is his method. I mean, he talked about Peppa Pig looking like a Picasso hairdryer, but his speeches often look like a Picasso hairdryer. Actually, it's quite an apt analogy.
So there's one theory that I've got about why he lost his way so much, because this is what Andrew Mitchell said when he was on the show last week, and he was explaining the importance of keeping your officials on side. Because there's a real risk of what happens if you don't.
One minister who so antagonised his officials that he raced across to the House to make a speech, and he had a speech given to him by his officials. He hadn't read it through properly, but he'd so antagonised them that as he turned over from page 6 to page 7 just said, "Minister, you're on your own."
Do you think that's what's happened here, David?
No. I mean, I've given quite a few speeches, not as many as Boris Johnson. This has never, ever happened to me because it's the one thing that you fear if you have a paginated speech. It's the one thing you make absolutely certain doesn't happen to you, or that you have a kind of thought in your head about what you're going to do if it does. It was one of these things where you just felt he suddenly not only didn't know where he was in the speech, he didn't know where he was at all. He didn't know. And I do remember having this kind of fear in the very earliest days of broadcasting that all of a sudden, and you go completely blank, and you not just forget the subject you were talking about, the immediate sentence you had in mind, but that the whole thing would desert you. Who is this person? I'm in the studio. What is this studio? What is the point of it all? And so on. And I feel he had an existential moment. And I'm not joking. I think he completely lost where he was and what he was doing for a moment.
David Cameron did say to me that when he did the first televised debate, which, as you remember, didn't do very well in, he said at the very beginning of that, he suddenly looked up and thought all the people that were watching, and he was in the middle of this, and what was he going to say? And everyone was relying on him. And he said that for the first time in his life, he was properly nervous. My theory on Boris Johnson's is the opposite, actually. I think he was completely winging it. I think this is somebody who... That is the top of his game, right? I know that sounds a bit weird to say, but the important way to understand it, he's super confident. He was winging it. Most of the time, that stuff works brilliantly for him, and it completely deserted him because it wasn't appropriate in the circumstances. I don't think they'd thought through, and he hadn't thought through whether this was the right audience for that kind of approach. So we get analysis by it all went wrong. Obviously, the bit where he shuffled his papers went wrong, but that is his style. And a lot of the time, people think it's very funny, and I think he didn't appreciate that wouldn't happen on this occasion.
Do you think it's also, David, it's partly, it reminded me a bit of the Ed Miliband bacon sandwich in that, in and of itself, the Ed Miliband bacon sandwich was quite funny, but the reason it took hold was because it sort of summed up everything that people thought about. And if Boris Johnson was riding high and everybody loved him, he could have winged it, yes, and he'd have brought the house down. And instead what it's done is slightly crystallise everything that's gone wrong in the last 2 or 3 weeks. That this is a man who's not across Owen Paterson, social care, sewage and rivers, trains to the north, and also it turns out even his old sort of party trick doesn't work anymore.
Well, the losing the place isn't a party trick. It's a disaster.
No, but I mean, I suppose the scale of disaster is greater because it comes. If you're riding high, suddenly everything is going wrong. The opposite.
It's higher because it's actually worse because you expect him to be able to busk it and get away with it, and actually he's completely flummoxed. He's flattened at that moment. That means subsequently, when he tries to pick up the joke, his audience are feeling actually incredibly anxious. What he's made is they don't think he's in command. They don't think it's funny, and so on. And then he goes off on this kind of prolonged Peppa Pig thing, which, I mean, I know that he's been in the perpetual state of having young children for the last 30 years or so, Boris Johnson.
Yeah, it was Muffin the Mule.
But actually, there comes a
originally.
point where you expect. There comes a point where you expect people to have kind of got beyond that, really, and to and so listening to how the audience take on that was actually really painful. I gather that earlier this morning, William Hague told our colleagues on Times Radio that he was clenching at that moment. I mean, and Danny, I'm not sure what clenching means. It's obviously a technical expression used by Tory leaders, etc., and so on. But I have a feeling it's not good.
No, it isn't. Look, somebody tried this morning arguing with me on Twitter who likes Boris Johnson that it had all been a great success because it connected with people who watch Peppa Pig. It's so funny when people do that. Obviously, it was a political disaster. It went over badly with the audience and it created a metaphor. Matt, you're correct. That's exactly what the problem with it was. But a skill is appreciating when that moment is and being able to cater your remarks. It turns out, I think that when he lost his place, that was actually the high point of that speech. Because it wasn't an appropriate speech for the audience that he was giving it to.
And on the sort of the substance of it, because he was addressing the CBI, and I spoke to Tony Danker, the head of the CBI, Sunday night, and we played it out yesterday, and he laid out some quite interesting, thoughtful things about the role of business and the markets and levelling up and all of that. And I think he sort of had higher hopes for the Prime Minister. And then you've got the Times leading article today, Pig's Ear. At a time of economic anxiety, business leaders deserve better than Boris Johnson's shambolic speech yesterday. They got it instead from Keir Starmer. I mean, it goes on to say that Labour is still a long way from rebuilding its economic credibility. But can Boris Johnson afford to make mistakes like this?
That's very significant. The Times leaders have been pretty critical of the Prime Minister for a long time. But that second part of it, that is a new part, actually. And Boris Johnson should pay attention. Keir Starmer has clearly moved the Labour Party somewhat in a fiscally conservative direction. How credible that really is and whether he'll be able to impose that remains to be seen, and whether Labour Party members like it, because if you don't like fiscal conservatism, Labour Party members, wake up, that is what your leader is doing. Personally, I do like it, so I approved of the direction that he took, and I think it's electorally savvy as well for a Labour leader. So I think that was quite significant, and he may not have got a big impact because Peppa Pig stole all of his coverage, but I thought that was also very significant yesterday.
David Sarah's just messaging. Boris made 2 speeches later in the evening that went down well, but you focus on the speech that didn't go so well. It reminds me slightly of that. It's a Steve Coogan.
Yep, Sarah.
Is it the day today where Steve Coogan's a swimming pool attendant and he goes, in 1979, no one died. In 1980, no one. In 1981, someone died. In 1982, no one. There's clearly a reason why we focus on the disaster. It was also, the one that was televised, and it was a big deal.
It's very important for people who are conservative inclined, who were listening to that yesterday, not to get themselves in a position where you can't accept that something that was clearly a disaster, that people could see was a disaster, is a disaster because you don't want it to have been one. It was one, right? And then you need to think about why it was one and begin to think how you avoid it being. But no wisdom lies down that route. Everyone just looks at you and thinks you're being ridiculous and doesn't trust your judgments on other things. So when something is a disaster, you need to notice it. You need to call it for what it is.
Yeah. It's the World Cup final. Harry Kane has got the penalty in the 91st minute. He steps up and skies it over the bar. And Sarah turns around and says, yeah, but he scored one last week.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Sarah. True. Other people, Ruth got in touch earlier saying I should shut up about Boris. You make yourself look more foolish than he did. I mean, that's a view. And more broadly, Danny, this idea of Tory unhappiness. Mm-hmm. Laura Kuenssberg tweeted yesterday saying there's a lot of concern inside. Originally it was a senior number 10 source and it became a Downing Street source, which made the conspiracy theorists said, it must be Rishi Sunak. So there's a lot of concern inside the building. It's just not working. Cabinet needs to wake up and demand serious changes, otherwise it will keep getting worse. If they don't insist, he just won't do anything about it. This isn't a cabinet that's going to rise up against Boris Johnson, is it?
Well, my view when I hear those things is like, you supported the Conservatives. You wanted Boris Johnson to be the leader of the Conservative Party. You won a majority. He's running the government. Who did you think he was, right? If that speech came to you as a surprise yesterday, who did you think Boris Johnson was? this is who he is. He isn't going to be any different before. He wasn't any different in the past. It's what the country chose. Along the way, I had a lot of misgivings about different parts of that, and they haven't changed much either. And so when I hear people say that, who were previously happy with it, sort of seems to have come as a big surprise to them that Boris Johnson's a bit shambolic and lost his place and talks about Peppa Pig. Why is that surprising?
Well, that's why we're very close, aren't we, in all this, to the King's wicked counsellor syndrome. We've touched on this a little bit before. If you can't say that your leader is a shambolic semi-idiot, then the thing that you have to say is that his team are no good, or the civil service are no, or somebody else, the advisors are no good. I mean, I saw it put around, I think this morning, I heard it put, that his team in number 10 needs to get a grip. And you think, hold on, he's the leader of his team in number 10 and so on. And Danny, you can maybe fill this in. If he's not going to get a grip, when people say somebody else in number 10 should get a grip, who do you think they're referring to? Because I can't see it.
We've made, I think, correct and very profound criticisms of Boris Johnson. It is also important to say the other things that can't change. He has got a lot of charisma and appeal. He's basically very often moderate and centrist. The policy of Brexit, which I disapprove of, was one that won a majority in the country. He had a solution to get Brexit through, albeit, I didn't think it was the right solution, and it's turned out to be flawed. It's important to recognise why he ended up being Prime Minister. So his critics need to understand his strengths, just as his supporters need to understand what his weaknesses are. And I don't think, by the way, that the fact that he lost his place in one speech, which absolutely is indicative of who he is, is like by itself the big revealing moment for his opponents, just like it ought not to be a great revealing moment for his supporters either.
Sure, Danny, but you missed out one of the biggest reasons that he was elected with the majority was in 2019, which was none of those things, but was a guy called Jeremy Corbyn. Really significant factor in the 2019 election. And you talked earlier, and I think it was significant in the Times Leader, about the mention of the speech that Keir Starmer actually did make to business leaders and that was approved of and so on, and which will come back in small ways in the future. He's not got Jeremy Corbyn anymore. He's gone. Keir Starmer is making it pretty clear that Jeremy Corbyn and Corbynism is gone. So the next thing that Johnson faces is not something that people will forgive you your sins for because they're so worried about the other guy.
And it was really telling, particularly during the Labour Party conference when I interviewed Tony Dank from the CBI. He was very, very positive about the Labour Party. And, and the Labour Party was laying it on thick with friends of business and all that. And if the Labour Party's getting its act together just at the moment where Boris Johnson's act is falling apart.
I mean, let's sort of like steady on here, right? I mean, Keir Starmer's made like a couple of speeches. In order to be fiscally conservative, you have to do things like say no to spending decisions, for example, and have your party behind you. I've got still, as David might imagine, I've got still quite a lot of big doubts about whether I really buy that and whether or not Keir Starmer is a strong enough character to impose his vision if he does have it, considering that he ran in the leadership election saying almost exactly the opposite to that. So there's a lot he has to prove. I face it, okay, I'm a hard audience, but a lot he has to prove, I think, in general, not just to me, but to other people about that approach. But David is completely right. Obviously, one of the components of people choosing Boris Johnson was Jeremy Corbyn, and that, yes, is different in the next general election.
Lovely stuff. Well, we've covered a lot of ground there, and I'm sure the Prime Minister was listening.